All right, ergonomic assessment. Let's talk about ergonomic assessment. What we're doing with ergonomic assessment is identifying the ergonomic risks in the workplace. You can think of an ergonomic assessment as a hazard analysis which focuses on ergonomic risks. There is ergonomic risk and ergonomic related injuries in every type of workplace, from offices to oil field work, from agriculture to construction. There's ergonomic risk in every workplace. And as we've already seen, 35% of injuries are ergonomics related, and is also the most expensive type of injury in our country. So it's very important to conduct an ergonomic assessment. And as a safety manager, a big part of your job will be to identify the ergonomic risks and recommend measures to control those risks and prevent ergonomic injury. An ergonomic assessment is a set of procedures for identifying the risks and the level of risk. Our objective is to, again, identify the risk and implement corrective actions to prevent injury. There are several methods that can be used. You can use a checklist approach with interactive forms, and we'll talk in more detail about using checklists and forms during this unit. There are a wide variety, a vast number of forms that have already been created by safety managers that could be used, or you could develop your own. You may need to develop your own. Again, more on this particular method later in the unit. Direct observation of the work as it's taking place is a method that is used for ergonomic assessment. Measurements, taking different measurements related to the work task, is a part of an ergonomics assessment. A safety manager may also utilize biomechanical modeling or analysis. Now, we're not going to get a lot into biomechanical modeling. Honestly, I think biomechanical modeling at that level, that should be left for the ergonomics specialist, the ergonomist. If we work for a company and we think we need biomechanical modeling, we should contact an ergonomist who would be willing to come in as a consultant and help us with that biomechanical modeling. Your best assessments are going to combine different methods, as you'll see as we walk through this unit, as we work through this unit. The best assessments will combine different tools, different methods. There are multiple risks that are involved, and some tools are best suited, some methods are best suited for certain types of ergonomic risks. I've broken down the ergonomic assessment process into 9 steps. Now, this is a general model. Different assessments may require variation from this model. An ergonomic assessment needs to be site-specific and task-specific, which means that not all assessments are going to fit all workplaces. You may develop an ergonomic assessment for workers who are installing rebar. Well, that same ergonomic assessment would not apply to workers in a warehouse that are moving boxes of materials. Different task requires different ergonomic assessment. Different ergonomic assessments may require some different steps, or you may have to spend time on more time on one step than another step because the task is different, the workplace situation is different. Now, if you do look at your textbook, it's recommended, but it's not required that you read chapter 14. If you do refer to your textbook, it mentions 13 steps in the process, but only discusses 7. That must be a typo in the textbook. There are a few typos in this textbook, like there is in every textbook. But this is a pretty big one. Again, It lays out, or it mentions 13 steps, but there's only 7 that are discussed. The procedure that I'm going to give you uses 9 steps, so it's slightly different, quite a bit different actually than the text. It's quite a bit different, but it's essentially the same process with the same objective: to identify ergonomic risk and control ergonomic injuries. The 9 steps, here they are in order, and we'll talk about each one in more detail in the remainder of the lecture. First of all, become acquainted with the task. Know the task that you're assessing. If it's construction workers setting rebar, know the task. Know the work environment where the task is taking place. That's second step. That's the second step. Prepare for the assessment. Make sure you have all the tools and materials and all of the appointments and everything that you need to do for the assessment. You got to prepare that in advance. Interviewing management. Talking to management about the task, about the risks, about the work that's being done in their workplace that they manage. Interview the workers. Talk to them about the task. Learn from them. Observe the task. And this is, in many ways, maybe the most important part of the assessment, but you really can't do this assessment correctly until you complete the other steps. But observing task is where we are watching what the workers are doing as the task proceeds. Now, these 3 steps here that are on the screen, I refer to these 3 steps combined as the data collection phase of the ergonomic assessment. We're collecting data that we'll analyze. Once we collect the data, we put it through an analysis procedure. That analysis procedure, our conclusions from that analysis, will culminate in a report where we identify risk factors, a corrective action plan, and other specific recommendations for the workplace, for the task. The last step in the process is the implementation of those control measures to protect the worker. Again, I presented this in the 9 steps. Now, in reality, the steps don't have to all take place in this exact order. Some of the steps may overlap. And there's not really a cookie cutter approach. Again, I don't want you to think there's a cookie cutter approach that's going to apply to every ergonomic assessment. Don't feel like you're restricted specifically to these 9 steps in this order. Use your critical thinking skills, your creativity. Modify the procedure to fit the task in the workplace that you're assessing. Okay, first of all, but the first step that I outlined was becoming acquainted with the task. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Like I said before, and this is an important note, ergonomic assessment should be site-specific and task-specific. As you become acquainted with the task, you want to develop a work plan, which are the steps in the task and the tools that are being used by the worker. The step-by-step sequence executed by the workers during the task and what tools they are using. Here's an example of a work plan for a simple task: mopping a floor. Janitorial work takes place in just about every work environment. Mopping a floor is one of those janitorial tasks. And this may seem menial, but there are injuries that can occur from mopping the floor. And again, we're just using this as an example, though, of what we mean by work plan. First step, the worker will execute when they are mopping a floor, collect the tools and the supplies needed to complete the task. And there are ergonomic risks potentially at this step, just getting all the tools together and getting ready to execute the job. Filling the mop bucket with the water and the cleaning chemicals. Again, potential ergonomic injury can occur from this step. Loading the mop. This is sticking the mop in the bucket and getting water on the mop. Once you get the mop head loaded, you're going to wring it out to squeeze out the excess liquid. Too much water is not a good thing. Too much cleaning liquid at one time is not a good thing. So you want to use the wringer to squeeze out excess liquid. And just the process of wringing out the liquid, there's a potential for ergonomic injury. Then you engage in the actual mopping. And you continue mopping until the mop head gets contaminated with too much dirt, and it needs to be recharged. At that point, you would repeat the cycle, starting with step 3. When one particular area is complete, you move the mop bucket and work on another area. When the entire area that you're mopping is complete, you empty the bucket, store the tools and materials. Again, at every step in this work plan, there's the potential for ergonomic risks. Some steps may be may be riskier than other steps, but there's an ergonomic risk at each of the steps. At this point, once you get the work plan together, you're going to start to get an understanding or some insight or a heads up of the possible risk factors that are associated with the task. You may also identify risk factors that are not specifically associated with ergonomic risk, and those would need to be addressed also. Our focus is ergonomic risk, but in the real world, if you're doing an ergonomic risk assessment and you identify another risk, maybe an electrical hazard, maybe they're mopping the floor in an area where a receptacle does not have GFCI protection, or maybe the receptacle has been damaged and there are exposed conductors, electrical wires. That would need to be addressed as well, even though it's not specifically ergonomics related. How do we become acquainted? Talk to management and the workers. This is going to be your first step, an initial discussion with management and the workers who are performing the task. They can give you insight into the steps involved and how the task is executed. You may do some outside research. Now, for mopping a floor, you may not need to do outside research. But if we were doing an ergonomics assessment in a warehouse setting where workers were manually moving heavy boxes or heavy loads, you may benefit from doing some additional research into the process. And observation, an initial observation. It's possible that before you start conducting observations to collect your data that you're going to analyze, you may do an initial observation just to get a better feel for the type of work and what's involved with the task. Okay, after we start to become acquainted with the task, we want to acquaint ourselves with the work area. What are some unique characteristics of the work area? For example, what type of work surfaces are we dealing with? Is it a smooth finished concrete floor that is subject to moisture? Is it a tile surface? Is it a wood surface? Is it an outdoor area where there is potential trip hazards in the workplace? Just some examples of different work surfaces that we need to take into account when we're doing our assessment. We also, at this step, we want to identify any other possible operations that would conflict with the task being assessed. Are there any environmental exposures, exposure to the elements, heat, sun, wind, cold? These can play a role as well in our assessment. Some work-related musculoskeletal disorders are exacerbated or partially caused by environmental conditions. Cold, for example, interacts with vibration and can result in certain work-related musculoskeletal disorders. Are there any hazardous energy sources that need to be controlled? Do we need to perform a lockout tagout procedure before the assessment? How to become acquainted? Again, talk to management workers, research, and observation. Make yourself as much as possible acquainted with the work area and with the task. Now, from a practical standpoint, you could combine the first two steps in this procedure, but I like to break it down into the two steps just so we understand that there is a difference. Mopping a floor in one work area may be different than mopping the floor in another work area. Not all work areas would be the same. Speaking of work areas and tasks being performed, what we see in the picture there is not an ideal work area for manually moving materials. They've got a hand cart loaded with some type of appliance or plumbing fixture, and they're backing it up the stairs. Not ideal situation, and certainly ergonomic risks as well as other risks associated with that particular task. Preparing for the assessment, step 3 in the model that I'm outlining. Gather the tools that you're going to need to perform the assessment. A camera and video camera is recommended. Now, video cameras can also take still photos, but it may be better, you may get better quality by having a separate camera and a separate video camera. But part of your observation will be a videotaping, video recording the work as it occurs. And as you're videotaping, you'll also be taking still photographs of the work process. Again, it's not absolutely necessary. I mean, if you have just videotape, you can capture still images from your videotape. There's technology that allows us to do that. But I recommend both, having both types of camera technology available. An audio recorder for conducting interviews is something that you need as well. And you could videotape your interviews. That way you have a video record, and which includes audio when you conduct your interviews with management and workers. And your audio recorder you could use your phone. Most smartphones have pretty good audio recording capabilities, so you could use your smartphone for audio recording, but I would not use my smartphone for taking my videotape, for recording the video. I would use a better quality video camera, a tool that's designed for that purpose. Same thing with the camera. You could get by with the smartphone, but a real camera is going to give you better quality results most of the time. Measurement tools, tape measures, laser measuring devices may be an option as well. Any paperwork that you use for your ergonomic assessments. As safety managers, we document what we do. Documentation will normally involve some type of paperwork. Now, it doesn't have to be physical paper. You could use an iPad with the forms installed on the iPad. We're seeing that with more and more companies where they're getting away from paper, but they're still using a checklist, a form, an interview schedule during their assessments or during their operations. So paperwork could be in digital form. It doesn't have to be in traditional paper form. Identify any unique personal protective equipment that you may need as a participant in this process. If you are observing workers, conducting an assessment of workers who are operating concrete saws, and there's a potential for silica in the area, silica dust, you would want to make sure that you have the proper PPE that would help protect you from silica, that would also protect you from any eye injuries. In a construction environment, you would want a hard hat and a high visibility vest. Make sure that you have the personal protective equipment that you would expect the workers to be wearing during that task. There are there's a wide variety of instruments that can be used in ergonomic assessments. Some examples: slip meter, noise meter, light meter, air tester or sniffer, or different terms for the same thing. Load cell, also referred to as a strain gauge, may be some instruments that would be applicable. If there are instruments that are needed for your assessment, you'll have to make sure you have those ready to go, make sure they're calibrated, and they are ready to take the measurements that they are designed to take. Verify the assessment schedule with the management. The first step in verifying the assessment is to set up the assessment time and date. Set up your assessment time and date with the person in charge of the workplace. The day before the assessment date that you have set up with management, you will want to call ahead and verify. They may have forgotten. You want to give them a reminder. You also want to make sure that the time and date that you set up previously is still a good time to perform the assessment. Conducting interviews. Asking the management and the workers questions about the task you're assessing. It allows you to gain a better understanding of the task and the ergonomic risks. It may require an initial interview when you are learning about the task in the work area, and then a second interview during or after the observation. The initial interview is not as important, but again, it may be necessary as you're acquainting yourself with the operation. I recommend using an interview schedule. An interview schedule is just a list of questions that you will ask during the assessment. I'll give you an example on the next slide. And there are already many examples that exist that have been created by other safety managers. And that's okay if you want to use other interview schedules created by other safety professionals, but you'll probably need to customize the interview schedule for the specific task. Again, an interview schedule prepared for one task may not apply to another task or another type of workplace. So even if you use an interview schedule that already exists, you'll need to do some customizing. You'll need to tailor it for your assessment. Conducting the interview, again, it's as simple as it sounds. You're asking the questions and letting them talk. Important there is letting them talk. Find my pen here. I want to underline that. You'll see some interviewers, they ask the question, but they don't give the person they're interviewing time to talk. They keep interrupting, or they end up answering the question for the person they're interviewing. Ask the question and let them do the talking. Try not to interrupt. The person you're interviewing should talk more than you talk, by far. I mean, 90% of the conversation should be the person you're interviewing answering your questions, and you listening and recording their comments, their statements. During the interview, don't give advice or make recommendations during the interview. That's not the right time to be making recommendations. You're just collecting data. You're gathering the information. Best practice is recording the interview using either an audio recorder or video recording, where you have audio and visual images of the interview as it takes place. But the thing about recording the interview, and this also applies to videotaping the work task, get permission first. Get permission from management. It's a good idea to have a signed statement where they sign off on your recordings. You don't want someone coming back on you later and saying, well, I never gave them permission to record the interview. I never gave them permission to videotape the work task. So you need to prepare a consent form. Again, this is best practice. Have a consent form that explains what you're doing, explains that you will be recording, and let them know by signing this consent form they are giving you permission to do the recording that you need to do. And I've never had this be a problem. If a company, if you work for the company as a safety manager and you're conducting the assessment, they're going to be on board with this. But consent forms are still a good idea. Now, if you're an outside consultant going into a workplace, if they spent the money to bring you into their workplace, they're going to give you permission to let you record whatever you need to record. But the consent form is still a good idea. And if you need any examples of consent forms or would like more information, let me know. I do not include an example of a consent form in this lecture. This is an example of an interview schedule. Now, notice in parentheses, it says office management. This would be the interview schedule that we would use with supervisory level employees. Now, this interview schedule is going to be different than the interview schedule that you would use with workers. The questions are going to be slightly different. You wouldn't ask a worker, for example, how many injuries have occurred in the last year. Well, you ask them that question, they're going to think about themselves specifically. You wouldn't ask them how many new employees are hired each year at your company. They're not going to know that. These are management questions. Now, as you are following through your interview schedule, you may need to do some occasional probing. Probing are additional questions that would be used to seek additional information or to clarify one of their statements. And here's an example of a probing question. Let's say we ask question 8. What are employees doing when they are injured? If they say mopping the floor, well, that really doesn't, mopping the floor, we need to be more specific. So your specific response to that answer, your probe, would be what step in the mopping process were they executing when the injury occurred? So that's an example of a probe. And now probing questions, you can have some probing questions prepared in advance and include those in your interview schedule. But usually your probing questions are going to be more in the moment. And they're going to be based upon their answers to the questions in the interview schedule. Now here is a interview schedule that you would use with frontline supervisors. I'm actually giving you 3 examples in 3 different scenarios. Your frontline supervisors are the workers in the field who are directly supervising the work. They are in the workplace. Some questions you would ask them. Just ask them to describe the normal work day. How many workers on your crew? In the last year, how many times have workers called in sick? How many injuries on your crew in the last year? What type of injuries? What type of work do they think is most likely to cause injury among their workers? Do your workers complain about being sore, being in pain? Ask them directly, do you ever experience soreness or pain? And then you could probe that a bit further. What body parts are most affected? How many hours per day? This is a good one for frontline supervisors. How many rest breaks do you have in a normal workday? If the frontline supervisor says, well, we have our lunch break and that's it, that might be something you're going to explore further as a possible contributing factor for work-related musculoskeletal disorders. How many days off do they get with no work? There are some industries they'll work their workers 2 or 3 weeks in a row without a day off. That's a potential problem. Ask them if they have any ideas for tools or machines that would make the job safer. Get their insight into how they could make the task safer for them and their employees. And what do you think would prevent injuries to your crew? Again, same process but different questions. Some of the questions you would ask office level managers would not be relevant for frontline supervisors. And here's an example of some questions you would ask workers. And sometimes you might get conflicting or contradictory responses. You ask this question of the frontline supervisor, they say one thing, but the workers may tell you, well, we don't get any days off. We have to work 2-3 weeks in a row sometimes without any days off. Ask them about their pain or soreness. What are the causes of their pain? Are specific activities related to their pain? Have you seen a doctor because of a job-related injury? If yes, ask them to describe. How could job-related injuries be prevented? What changes would you make to make your job safer and prevent worker injuries? What changes would make your job safer and prevent worker injuries? And a lot of times the workers are going to have the best insight into what needs to be done because they do the task. They feel the pain. They already have ideas on how it should be done differently. This is a good question to ask also. Do you feel like you can make suggestions to your supervisor? And what do you think is the top priority of your company and your supervisor? Again, same process, but different questions. And again, let me emphasize again that different types of work may require different types of questions. I've already talked about borrowing existing interview schedules and then changing them to fit the assessment you're conducting. That's a really common approach for ergonomic assessments. Next step, actual work observations. We observe workers performing the task being assessed. During this process, we do not interfere in the work process. The only time we would interfere would be if there is an imminent danger where someone is likely to get hurt or seriously injured if we don't speak up. If it's not an imminent danger where someone could die, you're there to understand the process. And sometimes we have to hold our tongue. You see someone lifting a heavy box incorrectly, we have to hold our tongue and tell them, hey, do it this way. That's not why we're here during this ergonomic assessment. Now later in the process, that's where we make our recommendations, and that's where we start to get changes implemented. Video record the work process. I didn't mention this earlier, but it may be advantageous to have multiple angles at work. You're taking video from multiple angles simultaneously. You might want to do multiple sessions at different times for the video recording and the observation. One of the cool things about video recordings, if you have this form of data, when you're doing the analysis, you can go back and go into slow motion. You can pause it to get a closer look. You can rewind if you need to take a closer look at something in the video. You can view a work task as many times as you want by rewinding and using slow motion features of the video playback. Now, your company probably won't have this technology available, but if it does, you can use different software tools, different programs to perform an analysis of the video recording. And I have included an article. It's not required for you to read. There's no quiz based upon this article, but there is an article about video-based ergonomic job analysis that you go to Blackboard and you can find this article. Now, one thing that I would recommend in some situations, if you have the video data, you could send it to an ergonomics lab for further analysis. You take your video from different angles, you send that video to the lab, they perform the analysis for you. And that might be a really useful option for busy safety managers, because most of you guys as safety managers will not be dedicated to just ergonomics. You're not an ergonomist. You're going to have a lot on your plate, wearing a lot of different hats. Getting another entity involved to help you with this analysis. I think it's smart safety management to sub out certain tasks, certain procedures. And you want to get the best assessment possible to help your workers. And for me, the best assessment possible would be get an ergonomist involved, let them do a video analysis for you. Listen to their recommendations. Okay, once we have all of our data, we conduct the analysis. From this analysis, we're going to identify the risk factors that are present. Is there awkward posture? Is the employee exerting excessive force? Is there vibration involved? Compression involved? Is it repetitive motion type of task where we need to consider that risk factor as well? After we identify the risk factors, let's do some risk assessment. Identify the level of risk associated with the task. In other classes, you've probably talked about risk assessment matrices. Using the FIND method or a risk assessment matrix, there are tools available to use for risk assessment. The idea of risk assessment: identify the highest risks, and that should be our priority for controlling once we identify those higher risk parts of a task. Now, a lot of this ergonomics assessment, the analysis of the data, is a qualitative assessment based upon your critical thinking, application of your knowledge from the research literature and from all of your training as a safety manager. You're going to bring those all into play as you're performing this qualitative assessment. By qualitative assessment, I mean you don't have numbers necessarily that you're using for your measurements. Now, if you have numbers available, if it's a type of task that you can, where you can perform a quantitative assessment, that can be very beneficial. But many of the tasks that we will analyze as a safety manager, it's going to be more qualitative judgments involved about the level of risk. There are a lot of different analysis tools available, and we will talk about most of these on this list. We could use the Rogers muscle fatigue analysis. This is a procedure that's been developed to assess muscle fatigue and how muscle fatigue is related to bone and joint disorders or other work-related musculoskeletal disorders. Now, we won't specifically be talking about the Rogers analysis tool, but we will be talking about the rapid upper limb assessment. In fact, that's going to be our next module in this unit. Rapid entire body assessment. And the acronyms for these two assessment tools, I'll bet you've heard these before from your other classes. RULA and REBA are the acronyms that represent these two types of assessment. We will be talking about how to use these particular tools in the next module. We will also talk about the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists and the tables that they've created. They've created threshold limit values for lifting operations. Again, this is lifting only. This is one of those tools that is focused on a specific part of a task, the lifting part of a task. Now, the RULA and REBA, that takes into consideration posture, repetition, a lot of the other ergonomic risk factors as well. We will also take a look at the SNOOK tables that have been developed over the last 50 years, maybe longer, at least last 50 years, by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company. Liberty Mutual has an ergonomics laboratory that is one of the leading ergonomics laboratories in the United States. And they've been working on ergonomic related issues for many, many years. The reason they spend so much time on these ergonomic injuries, they're an insurance company. The reason they're spending the time is because so many of their claims over the years are related to ergonomics related injuries. So they've invested a lot of time in better understanding these injuries. Now the Snook tables focus on lifting, pushing, and pulling tasks. And it's really about an analysis of force and excessive force that may cause injuries. We'll take a look at the NIOSH lifting equation. We'll have a module on the NIOSH lifting equation. Now this particular tool we will not be examining. If you'd like a copy of it, I can send you a copy, or I can make it available on Blackboard. But this is an ergonomics tool that was developed by the Washington State Department of Labor. Washington is one of those states, they have their own OSHA office. They don't depend just on federal OSHA. They have their own state level OSHA, and they've developed some pretty good ergonomics tools over the years. There are also other checklists and tools available. You know, a lot of them are developed by OSHA, and this is more the paper form type of checklist type of tool. We'll spend a module talking about using this type of checklist also. And one thing about many of the tools, especially the checklists, they can be modified to better suit the analysis you're conducting. You don't have to just go with what's on the sheet. You can modify them. Now for the Rula, Reba, for some of these, let me just mark them out. Rula, Reba, can't really change the lifting tables for from the ACGIH or Liberty Mutual. You don't want to mess around with the NIOSH lifting equation. So most of the modifications you're going to be making would be with the paper tools, like the checklist. After we've done our analysis, we've come to some conclusions. We're going to prepare documentation in the form of a written report. It's going to describe the task, the methods that we use for analysis, our findings, which would include the risk factors and the risk levels. Our corrective action recommendations are also, I would say, the most important part of the plan is our recommendations to make the workplace safer. There's not one format for the report. Later in this module, or in this unit, we're going to take a closer look at a sample report that is more practical than some reports that you may see conducted by or prepared by ergonomists. But that will give you a better idea of what a report can look like. The main thing, they should have a professional appearance. I identify some of the more important considerations here. Concise, clear, and written for your readers who are not going to be scientists. They're not going to be safety managers. They're not going to be professors. So you want to use language and a writing style that is easily readable. If we're writing this report for our managers that don't have any safety background, they're not scientists, we want to write to their level. And I always recommend write to an 8th grade level or lower when we're communicating with non-safety professionals, 8th grade level or lower. Also, less is more. Now, I've always hated in academia how we give page requirements for a project. We say we need a 15-page report on XYZ topic. Well, if you can cover XYZ topic in 5 pages, that's a better report. If you can thoroughly cover it in fewer pages, then less is more. You are writing to communicate. We're not writing to impress. Simpler is better, less is more. Don't waste your time, your reader's time, with a lot of superfluous information, and don't use words like superfluous. Here's a cover page for the sample report that's available on Blackboard. Again, this is not an academic paper. There's not a particular format to follow. This is just one of many possible variations. You want a report that communicates. communicates your findings and your corrective action plan. All right, well, that's just an overview of ergonomic assessment. Let me give you a quick summary. This has been a long lecture. About the length of this lecture is about the same length of time that we would have in one 50-minute class period. We're right at 47 minutes. Ergonomic risk and injury potential exist in every workplace. Ergonomic assessment is an important part of safety management. Assessment is a multiple part process with stages in the process likely to overlap. Assessment should be site and task specific. Good assessment is not completed until the controls are implemented. And there are many tools available to assist with our ergonomic assessment. And also let me reiterate that if ergonomic issues are serious in your workplace, one of the best things that you could do as a safety manager is convince your supervisors that we need to bring in an ergonomist, a specialist in ergonomics, to help with the assessment. Or maybe we don't bring them in. Maybe we don't have to bring them in, but we do the data collection and we send the data, especially the videos, to an ergonomist to get their professional input on the task that we're assessing.